Sandra Lee built a career in a space most people instinctively avoid. While many physicians pursued prestige, academic recognition, or quieter clinical paths, she leaned into dermatology's most visually intense and emotionally sensitive cases. The kinds of conditions that make patients hide, hesitate, or live for years in embarrassment became her daily work. What set her apart was not just technical skill, but the way she approached those moments with calm familiarity rather than distance. Over time, that approach translated into something unexpected: a global audience. By the time she reached her mid-50s, she had become one of the most recognizable dermatologists in the world, not because of institutional titles or academic fame, but because she allowed people to witness medicine in its rawest form. What she did in exam rooms, treating cysts, abscesses, and severe skin conditions, became a form of unfiltered storytelling once the camera started rolling. Viewers didn't just watch out of curiosity, they returned repeatedly, sharing videos and reactions that often sounded the same. They didn't fully understand why they were so drawn in, only that they couldn't stop watching. Her rise wasn't planned as a media strategy. It emerged from a simple idea that what happens behind closed clinic doors might help people feel less alone if seen honestly. That instinct became the foundation of a public identity that would eventually reshape her life entirely. From training to practice, building a life in medicine without a blueprint. Before the internet knew her name, Sandra Lee was simply a medical student, and later a resident navigating the long, demanding path of dermatology. She did not come from a family with medical influence or established connections in the field. Her career was built through the traditional, often exhausting route of training, exams, and long hours that leave little room for anything outside of medicine. Dermatology, for her, was never just about skin in a clinical sense. It was about people's relationship with themselves. Skin conditions carry visibility in a way few other medical issues do. They affect confidence, social interaction, and identity in ways patients often struggle to articulate. She noticed early on that treating these conditions required more than precision. It required a tone of communication that didn't amplify shame. When she eventually established her practice in Upland, California, she wasn't chasing a spotlight. She was building a steady clinical life rooted in patient care. The work was demanding but deeply meaningful. Each case carried its own emotional layer, and she learned to navigate both the medical and human sides of dermatology with equal attention. At the time, it was enough. A full practice, steady patients, and a predictable rhythm of care formed a life that already felt complete. The quiet skill that made patients stay and trust inside her clinic. Something subtle distinguished Sandra Lee from many other physicians. It wasn't a dramatic bedside manner or theatrical empathy. It was something quieter, a lack of hesitation when facing conditions others might instinctively recoil from. Patients often arrive at dermatology appointments carrying more than symptoms. They carry embarrassment, fear of judgment, or years of avoidance. She developed a way of speaking that removed that tension. Without over-explaining or softening reality into vagueness, she normalized it. A cyst wasn't treated as a spectacle or a crisis. It was a condition with a solution. That balance made patients feel both safe and respected. Over time, her practice became a place where people came not just for treatment, but for relief from the emotional weight they had been carrying. Many patients had spent years hiding conditions that affected their daily lives. In her care, they often encountered the first medical environment where they didn't feel the need to apologize for their bodies. This approach, though unremarkable on paper, would later become the defining emotional signature of her public presence. It wasn't something crafted for cameras. It was already there in the way she worked, long before anyone was watching. When a camera changed everything, without changing her intention. Viral recognition and the unexpected weight of visibility. As her audience expanded, Sandra Lee's work transitioned from niche online content to global curiosity. Her videos were shared widely, often by people who had no prior interest in dermatology. The reactions were consistent. Fascination mixed with disbelief that such procedures could be both so clinical and so strangely compelling. This growing visibility changed the scale of her professional life. What had once been individual patient encounters became part of a larger public narrative. She was no longer just a dermatologist. She had become a recognizable figure associated with a very specific type of medical transparency. Yet the core of her approach remained unchanged. She continued to emphasize respect for patients and clarity in explanation. Even as the audience grew into the millions, the tone of her work stayed grounded in the same principles she had always used in her clinic. This period also marked the beginning of a subtle tension. Visibility brings opportunity, but it also introduces expectations that can slowly shift how a person is perceived. For Sandra, the challenge was maintaining authenticity in a space that was rapidly turning her medical practice into public entertainment, television, transformation, and a new kind of audience. The success of her online presence eventually led to television. A dedicated show expanded her reach far beyond digital platforms, introducing her work to audiences who may never have encountered her otherwise. The format amplified what had already made her videos compelling: real patients, real procedures, and real emotional outcomes. What made the show resonate was not shock value, but transformation. Patients who had lived with visible conditions often experienced a shift that went beyond physical treatment. The relief on their faces, the emotional release, and the return of confidence created moments that felt deeply human. Sandra Lee became a steady presence within that narrative. She was not positioned as a celebrity doctor performing for the camera, but as a clinician guiding patients through vulnerable experiences. That distinction mattered. It kept the focus on care rather than spectacle. As seasons continued, her professional identity expanded into something multifaceted: clinician, educator, media figure, and entrepreneur. Each role added complexity, but also demanded more of her time and emotional bandwidth. Behind the success, the balancing act was becoming increasingly intricate: marriage, stability, and the private side of a public life. For many years, Sandra Lee's personal life appeared stable and consistent. She had built a long marriage with a fellow dermatologist, sharing both professional understanding and family life. Their partnership reflected a dynamic where one life unfolded publicly, while the other remained largely private, a balance that can work only through ongoing negotiation and mutual respect. From the outside, it seemed like a foundation that supported her expanding career. Behind the scenes, however, long-term relationships evolve in ways that are not always visible. Careers change pace, personal priorities shift, and time reshapes people in ways that are difficult to measure externally. What remained consistent was her commitment to her work and patients. Even as her public profile grew, she continued practicing medicine, maintaining a direct connection to the clinical environment that had defined her early career. This dual existence, public figure and practicing physician, required constant navigation. It was not a life built around celebrity, but around responsibility. And that responsibility extended in multiple directions at once. A diagnosis that changed the rhythm of everything. In 2019, Sandra Lee publicly shared a breast cancer diagnosis, revealing that she carried a BRCA2 genetic mutation and would undergo a double mastectomy. The decision to speak openly was not framed as a media moment, but as a continuation of the honesty that had always defined her professional identity. She described the experience with clarity rather than dramatization. The treatments, surgeries, and recovery process became part of a public conversation that many viewers found deeply personal. For some, her openness encouraged screenings or conversations they had delayed for years. The experience also reshaped her relationship with time and vulnerability. Illness has a way of compressing priorities, making previously distant concerns feel immediate. For someone whose work already involved navigating human vulnerability, this added a new layer of lived understanding. What stood out most was not just survival, but integration. She did not return to her life as though nothing had happened. Instead, the experience became part of how she spoke about health, boundaries, and the importance of self-awareness in both medicine and life. Fame, pressure, and the quiet shift in personal identity. As her career continued to expand, so did the demands that came with sustained visibility. Fame, especially in a field rooted in medicine, carries a unique tension. It amplifies trust, but also reduces privacy. Every appearance, interview, and update becomes part of a larger public narrative. For Sandra Lee, who had built her platform on authenticity, the challenge was not performance but preservation. preserving the parts of life that did not need to be shared. Over time, she became more selective about what she revealed publicly, particularly regarding her personal relationships and private transitions. This shift was not dramatic, but noticeable. Long-term audiences observed changes in tone, energy, and emphasis. She spoke more about boundaries, sustainability, and long-term health, not just physical, but emotional and professional. These changes reflected something deeper, a recalibration of identity. When a life becomes highly visible, the question of what remains private becomes increasingly important. That negotiation became part of her midlife experience, shaping how she moved through both work and public engagement. Midlife reflection and the search for what comes next. Reaching her mid-50s brought Sandra Lee into a phase of reflection that was less about achievement and more about direction. At this stage of life, questions often shift from, "What can I build next?" to, "What still matters most?" For someone with an already extraordinary career, the answer is not always obvious. She continued working, filming, and practicing medicine, but the tone surrounding her work suggested something more internal was unfolding. Experiences such as illness, career expansion, and personal transitions had layered into a life that was both successful and complex. Rather than signaling an ending, this stage represented refinement. She was no longer building toward recognition, she was shaping how she wanted to exist within what she had already built. That included choosing energy more intentionally, prioritizing meaningful work, and maintaining connection to the clinical roots that grounded her. Midlife, in her case, did not represent reinvention in a dramatic sense. It represented integration, bringing together all the versions of herself that had emerged over decades of work, visibility, and personal change. A life still unfolding, defined by presence rather than conclusion. Sandra Lee's story does not resolve into a single theme or final statement. It remains ongoing, shaped by work, health, and personal evolution that continue to unfold in real time. What stands out most is not a single achievement, but consistency, the steady presence she brings to patients, audiences, and her profession. Her impact is visible in individual moments, patients regaining confidence, viewers becoming more attentive to their health, and people feeling less alone in experiences they once considered isolating. These moments, multiplied over years, form a legacy that is less about fame and more about influence through care. At this stage of life, she appears neither paused nor finished, but settled into a deeper form of continuity. The urgency of earlier years has been replaced by something steadier, shaped by experience and perspective. Her story continues without neat closure because it was never built as a performance of arrival. It was built around showing up, again and again, for work, for patients, and for the human realities that medicine inevitably reveals. Top of form, bottom of form.